All right. Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to Conversations with the Curator. We are back to the owl setup again. So hopefully no technological issues. Good job, little owl. I say no technical.
Knock on wood.
Knock on wood. So today is a big one. As you can see that first, wow, it's been a while since we made a really good pun.
I
To
know.
say it's a big one because you are sitting behind this massive document behind you, which is what we are going to talk about today. So we are here to talk about a treaty that was signed here in 1758. But we can't talk about 1758 without first talking about how we arrived at 1758. Now, we could do an entire program on the walking purchase in 1737. Uh, But if we can, let's summarize what the walking purchase did and why its reverberations were so tragic.
Sure. So the short of it, right? Like walking purchase in a nutshell, right? Is the walking purchase is the beginnings of native removal
Mm.
from this part of North America,
Mhm.
right?
And what is that? What do we look like at that time?
We look very there's a book that I often think about when I think about this, which is like here I am, like historian says book, but the book I think about is Daniel Richter's Looking East from Indian Country.
Oh,
And it is about these interactions between the indigenous peoples of North America and European settlers,
mm,
right? And I think the story we are often told, that we get told in school when we're doing our Pennsylvania history, that we kind of, has become legend, right? Is this
mm,
idea of European settlement of North America and the Europeans as this agent of
mm,
violent change
mm,
and then often violent change.
mm,
That's true, right? But like why I mentioned the Daniel Richter Looking East from Indian Country is the reality of it is like in that like the 1730s, the 1750s, Easton, the Lehigh Valley, this part of Pennsylvania, broader Pennsylvania in general, is Indian country,
mm,
right? So like when we think of what happens with the walking purchase, which is, the gist of it, right? The Penn brothers do a land agreement with the local Lenape, and it is about the acquiring of land in like a day's travel, right? The people that are supposed to do the walking run and acquire more land than they should,
mm,
right? That's in a very shortened version,
mm,
right? But all of that, the kind of like substrate of all this is like Easton was Indian country. And by that, what I mean is that if you want political power, the people who are like, the main political
mm,
forces in this part of the world, it's not necessarily the British Crown.
mm,
It will be. It is these Native American nations,
mm,
right? So an important thing to think about, right, is that like when the walking purchase happens and then like when the Treaty of Easton happens,
mm,
like the indigenous people that are in Easton
mm,
in the 1750s or who are like interacting with people here in Easton or in the Valley,
mm,
they are really the people with the upper hand
mm,
numerically and politically.
mm,
This is, of course, also, though, very much a story of European settlement
mm.
and European expansion,
Okay.
right?
Right.
So the walking purchase is this removal and ceding of land from like Lenape land
Mhm,
to this, what is ultimately a triangle
mhm,
originating out
mhm,
from hither, right? That is, the Lenape dispute that, the Iroquois agree to that. The Iroquois being kind of the larger political entity at the time, that's what gets enforced. Right, so it's like really what we're seeing with the walking purchase and then with the Treaty of Easton and all this is an important thing to consider, which is we are dealing with nations, right? We are dealing with groups and we are dealing with political entities that have power, political power over the land. And sometimes that political power looks very different than European power, or what European ideas of power would be. But it is very much, and I think it's very just kind of important, especially as we're going into the Treaty of Easton, to like keep that in mind, right? Because it's like you could very easily have this discussion that it's like the English and the French and then the like Native Americans are on the side, right? But like they are very much the main character in this, right? In a way. So I think that kind of takes your maybe your walking purchase question and kind of like explodes it in a little more ways, right? But like the short of it is the walking purchase is this moment where it's a trick, right? Like land is taken from the Lenape via the dirty deeds of the Penn brothers, who were a problem often.
Yes.
And a quote that I think is very important, right? This is by T.D. Uscombe, who is a Lenape leader who will be at the Treaty of Easton. He says of this moment, and this is like a quote, and there's kind of a thing to say about like quotings and how that works, but we can kind of talk about that later. But he says, "This very ground that is under me was my land and inheritance, and it was taken from me by fraud." And he says that while he is standing in Easton, right? So it's powerful. It's astounding,
and
right?
we'll get there, but the likelihood that the treaty behind you was signed half a block from here makes this a little too.
The land, yeah, the land that is my land and my inheritance, right?
Yeah. So Easton in 1737 is not much of anything.
Not much of anything to speak of, no,
Right.
right.
It is officially founded in 1752, which is 15 years after the walking purchase.
Right.
And then only 6 years after that, the treaty is signed.
Right.
As I just said, possibly half a block from here in Center Square. So if we are talking on the ground in, I don't want to say the center of town because that was all it was the center of town.
Yeah, the town is the center of town.
Right, yeah. What does Easton look like when we are meeting for this treaty?
Easton is the way Easton is historically talked about in this case is true, right? Which is there's a kind of 20th century book written about Easton that is called A Frontier Village. That's what Easton was, right? Like Easton wasn't the large city we think of it today. Easton certainly wasn't the like large urban sprawl we think of that kind of like rolls into like Wilson and Palmer and rolls into like outside, so it's like, it's not that. It is a small village at the forks of the Delaware, right? There is, at the time the Treaty of Easton happens, there's like a handful of buildings, a handful of people here. Certainly Easton is laid down and surveyed by William Parsons at the beginning of the 1750s. Our very own 1753 Bachman House is built in 1753. But there's not much here to speak of, right? It's a village on what Europeans would call the frontier, right? Because while we might be calling it the frontier village, and we have this idea of the frontier in, like people out on the Old West or out in the frontier, right? But this is true there and is true now. The idea of the frontier is this idea of, you're in this place where you're far away from the center right? Like you're in the wilderness, you are you are away from everything and you've entered kind of this exotic place, which is of course a European conceptualization, right? Like what Easton really more so was what people refer to as something like a contact zone, right? Easton was this place that was like on the fringe of English Empire,
Okay.
really, but it was this place where that political entity we could think of as like English Pennsylvania. And then that political entity we could think of as an indigenous Pennsylvania contacted. That happens in other places too, right? That'll happen in the Wyoming Valley. That'll be that whole kind of swath west of us, right? Like the Wyoming Valley, Shamokin, now Sunbury, out in like Lancaster, right? So it's like that whole swath of area. Traditionally, you could refer to that as the frontier in the 18th century, which is to say, like, Europeans are there and then there is nothing. It's terra incognita. No, there's non plus ultra. There's nothing past here, right? But it is this place where two nations meet. And that's really what Easton is in the 18th century, right? It's not where there is English power in the colonies, right? Like there you need like Philadelphia, Charleston, Boston, right?
Yeah.
But it is a English and German town, and far away from those in 18th century senses. But yeah, really kind of there's not much here to speak of.
And we'll get into it deeper in another one of my questions, but we've talked about this, especially in some of our Warehouse Valley conversations about why Easton was such a strategic location. And we saw that from the very, very early days of Easton, like it's on two rivers for a purpose.
Absolutely.
And that will come into play as we get farther along, especially when we're thinking in 1758 and all of these people are coming here to sign this treaty. Where are they staying? Who's feeding them? Things like that, right? So let's get into what is happening geopolitically on the East Coast. I mean, look.
Big thing, yeah.
Things happen. So the mid and the North Atlantic regions specifically are smack in the middle of the 7 Years' War. What we know in the US is the French and Indian War, but it was debates about is it part of the 7 Years' War? Is it its own thing? It really depends on where you go, who you talk to, what historian you get into an argument with.
Right.
What role does this region specifically play in this theater?
This is
I didn't even finish the question. You're like,
that's because I'm so excited to talk about the 7 Years' War, Sarah. The thing we call the French-Indian War, this historian says is a theater of the broader 7 Years' War. The same way you could talk about the war in the Pacific being a theater of World War II, right? So the 7 Years' War was massive, right? So just like I will do this briefly because I could spend a lot of time with this. So here are some of the places the 7 Years' War is happening. And this is happening between 1756 and 1763, which yes is not 7 years. So
you realize you're becoming the meme of like the corkboard of the string.
So excited. So it is essentially the 7 Years' War is a war fought between Great Britain and Prussia, more or less, and then France and Austria, more or less. Russia switches sides midway through. But what that also means is that one side of that is Great Britain, Prussia, Portugal, and Russia. And the other side is France, the Holy Roman Empire, neither Holy Roman nor sometimes an empire, Russia, Spain, Sweden, and Bengal. It's like the other chunk of it. So this is what that looks like.
Laughing. This
is what this looks like.
Yeah.
So in Europe, various things are happening. There is the Third Silesian War in
Mm.
Prussia, the Pomeranian War between Sweden and Prussia that has nothing to do with Pomeranian dogs. There is the Spanish invasion of Portugal in 1762. There is the Anglo-Spanish War between Britain and Spain. That is where Spain cedes Florida to Great Britain in exchange for Manila and Havana, and Spain receives Louisiana from France.
I need a minute here, hold on.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there. There is an amphibious assault on the French that William Pitt leads. In the Americas, there's the French-Indian War. More on that in a moment. Then there is the war called the Fantastic War, which is a war that occurred between Portugal and Great Britain and Spain and France. And in that, there is briefly this attempt to capture Colonia de Sacramento, a Portuguese settlement that goes back and forth. Then there are wars in India that are happening simultaneously to that, the Third Karanak War and the Bengal War. And the Bengal War is ultimately the East India Company versus the Bengalese. And what that ends up meaning is that is the beginning of English colonization of India.
Oh.
Then there is a war in West Africa where William Pitt takes the French settlement of Saint Louis in Senegal. And then the French acquire Dominique and all these sorts of things.
There's a quiz at the end.
This is to say, I wouldn't say the 7 Years' War is the First World War, because I would say the War of the Spanish Succession is the First World War, but I would say the 7 Years' War is a really good candidate for possibly the Second World War, because this is a war that is happening in Europe, both of the Americas, India, and West Africa simultaneously. Is it connected? Yes or no? So the result of that, and then we'll get to the French-Indian War, but this is very important as I wave my finger like that, which is obnoxious, but it's true. So the result of that is that's the beginning of what we would think of as big B British Empire, right? That is so after the dust settles on the French-Indian War, it's the end of French influence in North America. England acquires that, England in India, right? This is the beginning of the Pax Britannia, the beginning of, though not the beginning of the Pax Britannia, not that, but the beginning of the empire upon which the sun never sets. It's the beginning of the decline of the Spanish Empire, which I'll say that, I could go on that forever, but but importantly, what's happening there, think of the things that the English and the French are acquiring, the things I mentioned there. The English acquire territory in Senegal, in West Africa. The French acquire Dominique, and they're kind of the British then also acquire territory in the Caribbean. Why is that important? It's important because the British are capturing a West African area that becomes the African terminus of the triangle trade. The French acquire a Caribbean settlement that's a sugar plantation, right? So this sets up this kind of large moment of the story of enslavement in the 18th century. But into that world, right, this is vast, right? And there's pieces kind of moving around. They're connected, they're not. It is this rise of British power, but also this rise of British debt. They're putting so much money into war. They're going to end up in debt at the end of it. That's going to be very important later on. Just spoiler alert, that will be important. But what happened, then we get to the French-Indian War. That is between Britain and France. Weirdly, when we're thinking of wars that are occurring, right? And you could even make a case that the French-Indian War is kind of the beginnings of this is the first shot fired, right? In what will become the World War that is the 7 Years' War. And you could make a case that the first shots to be fired in the French-Indian War occur in Pennsylvania and are because of George Washington, who is involved in this in the Pennsylvania back country. So the French Indian War is happening, and it is roughly about competing claims to the Ohio River Valley,
Mhm.
right? Kind of
Mhm.
everywhere west of the Allegheny Mountains.
Okay.
And what that means is that the English and the French,
Mhm.
who, you know, in the geopolitical realities of Europe and in the broader world, hated each other for centuries,
Mhm.
right? But if you're thinking on the map of North America, it
Mhm.
is England on the coast
Mhm.
of North America,
Mhm.
Spanish down here doing their thing,
Mhm.
and then the French in the middle, like French
Mhm.
Louisiana,
Mhm.
and then up into the Ohio River Valley,
Mhm.
up along the Mississippi, and then up into Quebec, right?
Okay.
So
And Ohio at the time is not the state of Ohio.
Ohio
It
is the Ohio River Valley.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So what that meant before the French Indian War is the English are kind of hemmed in
Okay.
to North America, right?
Right.
And they're kind of hemmed in by two powerhouses of empire.
Mhm.
The Spanish,
Mhm.
who had been there since 1492,
Mhm.
and then the French.
Mhm.
They can't go west,
Right.
right? So the war is about, you know, what's going to happen to the Ohio River Valley,
Mhm.
right? And like what settlement can occur there.
Mhm.
What that also means is that various indigenous nations align with each of them, right? So like the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy
Mhm.
align with the British, and then the Native Americans of the Laurentian Valley, that would be this along the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Algonquin, the Abenaki, and the Huron align with the French.
Mhm.
So it is like what is happening in the broader world, right? Which is ultimately, and why I'm saying World War and
Mhm.
kind of really settling that, right? Like
Yeah.
everything we kind of talked about in the rest of those other theaters of war, though I didn't get too into it, it's about alliances and the geopolitical reality, right? The dominoes are falling, the same way you think of the First World War, right? It's just like one thing happens, and then it's a series of alliances that collapse. Um, that's what's happening here. But what's happening in the French Indian War is that it is these two empires of the English and the French,
Mhm.
and then their indigenous allies
Right.
at war with each other in like Western Pennsylvania, right? Like the French Indian War is right here.
Right.
So like we are like living very much within it.
Mhm.
So that is kind of my broader geopolitical thing that I feel like I should stop because I could go on for a while because
Right.
I never thought I'd be a 7 years war guy, but here I am.
You know, I can bring Spain into it and Tim is sold.
That's the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, so. Not only is there this broader global conflict playing out in arguably every corner of the globe.
Mhm.
Microcosm that to the east half of North America. Where it is the Spanish from one side, the French from the other side, the English kind of hanging on by a thread on the coast.
Right.
And then microcosm that even further with our tiny little frontier village, who had maybe a whopping 50 people that lived here. And I'm being very generous with that, because I don't think
Right.
it went past 40.
Absolutely. Yep.
Uh,
Oh, and another thing to consider in
sorry.
that, because this will impact us in Pennsylvania. When the war is focused up here, which is to say like the early parts of it, and it's like the fighting with the French and the Battle of Quebec, right? Kind of, and this, you know, like that whole thing. The British North America is very prosperous because it's these local farmers and industries and all that are feeding that. Eventually, the war is going to shift south, right? So it's going to then that ripple into like South America. Then that is like this kind of like moment of economic collapse for England's colonies here, because there's no longer that market for like selling food or doing or something like that.
Okay.
So that's another thing to consider too.
Okay, yeah, and well, no, that actually kind of leads in really well, so. We're thinking about this tiny frontier village who is, believe it or not, is playing a pretty big role in everything that is happening. And if we think about why Easton was settled where it was, because of the trade routes, because it had always been a gathering place. It continues in that role.
Mhm.
And that is why we all end up here in 1758 to sign this. I say we, like, I was there. So.
I don't think I was there.
If I do, I have no memory of it.
Yeah.
So it is the British colonial governance of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. 13 indigenous nations send their representatives to treaty negotiations. Why does this happen in Easton and not, for example, Philadelphia or somewhere further north?
I really think it's the strategic location of Easton, right? Like, I think there is, because I don't necessarily think they're thinking of it as like, oh, this is where the walking purchase happened. Like, I don't think that they're not thinking about it in that sense.
Right.
I think it is the strategic, because it is strategically close to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
It is strategically close to New York. It is strategically close to the centers of English power. So it's close to New Jersey, right? And
Right.
kind of the government of New Jersey is involved. And kind of with that proximity and with that idea of it being on the frontier, it is also close to the nations they are attempting to treaty with, right? So it is there's a lot of, it's strategically, really, it makes sense for it to be here, right? Even though it might be not much here to speak of, shall we say, but it does strategically make sense.
Right.
A lot.
And I mean, that could work out to everyone's benefit. I mean, even if you're just pitching up tents in the middle of like the border of Center Square, you gotta put everybody.
Absolutely,
somewhere.
yeah.
And it's really ironic because we're gonna talk about this, but the signatures of the 13 nations are right above your head.
Yes.
And then to my left, to your right, is a map of New Jersey.
Right.
So let's crack at like the details of what is happening. You know what, can you actually, I don't really get a good scale because you're like right in front of it. Can you see if you can stand up and maybe the camera will zoom so we can see like how big it is? Come on, camera.
Can you see it?
No, the camera's not moving at all.
It's not gonna do.
No. Oh, no, nice and slow, nice and slow. Maybe keep talking.
Cripply moving up slow.
Yes.
But here's the Treaty of Easton.
Oh, no, now just pan to you and not.
I would
it's getting
say-
there.
I would say it's good, like 3 feet by 3 feet.
Okay,
It's a pretty decent sized document. Of course, it's meant to be like it's a important geopolitical document,
Right.
so it's kind of, there is this kind of like largeness that
Right.
it should have, right?
Right.
But as a tangible physical object, but yeah, it's pretty large.
oh no, now it's good. Oh, now your head is right smack in the center of it.
Oh,
Good work,
weird,
good work.
weird.
You planned that whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's displayed very, very prominently. Exhibit, you cannot miss it. And it is placed in such a way that you can see both sides of it.
Right.
So let's talk about what they are negotiating, what both sides are negotiating for.
Okay.
In this.
So this is both sides, I would say, are going into it with very specific goals, right? There are kind of a series of sub goals, I would say, but like the goals include, I want to see where's my notes. Okay. So for the British, like the British representatives that are coming here to do this, like Conrad Weiser, these, various people that are here. The goal is these various nations don't side with the French against the British. That is, that we want them to, the English want them to not do that, right? So it is ultimately this attempt to like either ally them with the British, or B, have them maintain neutrality, but absolutely not C, ally themselves with the French, right? So the way the treaty lays out is that Native American groups would not fight on the side of the French against the British in the current war. The current war being the French Indian War, the larger thing, right? Pennsylvania would cede back large lands, which the Pennsylvania would give back lands that the Iroquois had previously ceded. So in exchange for that, there was partially that. Then there was British colonial governors promised that the Iroquois and other groups would maintain their rights over the Ohio River Valley.
Okay.
Essentially west of the Allegheny Mountains, and would say something that would then ripple into the later 18th century. That isn't actually, like, when you look this up, it doesn't necessarily say like this happens at the Treaty of Easton, because it will get codified later on. But this is this kind of like first legalistic triangulation that I know of, that the British say after the war, we will not do settlement west of the Ohio River or west of the Alleghenies. That'll be important later on. That is codified in the 1763 proclamation line.
Yep.
The other element that happens here is the Lenape cede all remaining claims to the province of New Jersey.
And that's why it's.
That's why it's there.
Really
So they're ceding claims to New Jersey, and they are doing that in exchange for the sum of 1,000 Spanish dollars, which are paid immediately here in Easton. Lump sum.
Why in Spanish dollars?
I'm happy you asked that. So it's Spanish dollars because in the 18th century, until there is the American dollar, Spanish dollars are the kind of like the coin of the realm.
Okay.
Right? And when you say Spanish dollars, what you mean are pesos de oro, like they are pieces of 8 from a pirate movie, right? And the thing about it, why they are significant, is because the Spanish coined them in like Potosi, like down in South America. And of course, through like horrific indigenous, essentially bordering on enslavement, mining, right? But what they did is those coins were silver. You knew the weight of them. You knew how much they were. They were minted in a very particular way, that they looked a very certain way. They had like the coat of arms of the Spanish kings with the pillars of Hercules on them, plus ultra, then they said, because there was more beyond Gates of Gibraltar. But and why they call them a pieces of 8 is because now we think of like, I have a quarter, I have a dollar, I have a nickel, I have a penny, right?
A quarter of what?
A quarter of what? But a pieces of 8, like a piece of 8, literally they were thinking about it as silver, right? So it's like this weight in silver, and you call it a piece of 8 because you can cut it into pieces, right? So it's like, I'll pay you with half of this in silver, right? So when they pay them in $1,000 Spanish dollars, they are paying them in the 1,000 equivalents of silver, right? So it's ultimately like a currency that is backed. That idea, then, just as a aside, the word dollar comes from thaler, which was a coin used in the Holy Roman Empire. So like our dollar is connected to like medieval currency in the Holy Roman Empire, which was then connected to Spanish dólares and then connected to our dollar. Fun facts with Tim.
So much going on here.
So much going on there. So that was like the outcome of that, right? So that treaty, and that didn't come out of the blue. It's heavily negotiated.
Right.
There was a series of like negotiations that happen privately, and then there are negotiations that happen publicly, but they're kind of like theatrical speeches, right? So it's meant to be like there's an element of performativity to treaties, right? And so by the time this happens, it's kind of like by conclusion, this is what's going to happen. And this has major repercussions, right? Because it's these groups that come here won't ally themselves with the French. And then the question is, so it's like, we kind of say in the label behind me says like, this is instrumental in the end of the French-Indian War. And it really is, right? Because like, we don't speak French, right? Like there isn't any French speaking. I mean, there's people in Quebec speak French, and there's people speaking French there. But like the people in Quebec speak French because that was like a center of Frenchness in the 18th century, right? But like after this, the French aren't in the Ohio Valley.
Right.
Like they had been there like trading beaver pelts for a while, but then they're gone, right? So like this was a shifting of a political tide that doesn't end,
Mhm.
but it is the beginnings of a trajectory that'll end
Mm,
this theater of the 7 Years.
okay. Whew. So I'm thinking like the social conditions that are happening because I don't even know where I want to start with this. So if we think of like, there are 13 different nations that are present here, not including Great Britain, representatives from Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Historically, let's just say this kindly, those 13 nations did not always get along with each other.
Correct.
Right. Um, so that alone is significant to have everyone in one place. Not for a day, not for 2 days, weeks.
Weeks.
Yeah.
Here in
Yes,
Easton.
yeah.
I mean,
Right right here,
the
right
thing I was,
outside.
so there's like the actual realities of what that looked like, right? But like,
Right.
think about like the broader reality of the war, right? And I think that's kind of an important way to think about it, right? So as you get like throughout all of history, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Russia, Spain, Sweden, and Bengal weren't always on the same side with each other, right?
Mhm.
But alliances happen
Right.
because of geopolitical, as they continue to do, right? Like alliances happen because of impending geopolitical realities, right? And like the geopolitical realities that are forged here in Easton in the 1750s, that will have major repercussions in the end of the 18th century, right?
Yeah.
So like a couple things to think of, right? Just as asides, right? So it's like with the French going, you then all of a sudden have, in a European view, nothing west of the Ohio Valley.
And I'm thinking
The
this is
Spanish
really
are down
ironic
there.
that
Yeah.
you can't see us, or you can't see what I'm pointing at, but not 2 feet from me is a giant painting, a rendition of, I'm just gonna read the caption. The first frontier from the forks of the Delaware to the Blue Mountains and beyond, 1737 to 1763. All of that's gonna change.
All that's gonna change,
Yeah.
right? But like, what happens, it's the English agree, we're not gonna settle west of the Ohio Valley. And they agree that here in Easton, they'll agree that the proclamation line, and Parliament will say that, and the king will say that, right? But it's like, you're living here in Pennsylvania, and you wanna go west, right? Or you're living here in the colonies and you want to go west. And it's like, oh, there's all that land west of the Alleghenies. So those beaver pelts we could be selling, all those nascent ideas of manifest destiny. Why can't we do that? Right. So it's like that idea of Americans wanting to settle west of the Allegheny Mountains. And the British Crown saying, no, that's in the Declaration of Independence, right? Like that's one of the grievances, right? The idea of like, England will come out of this war as an imperial powerhouse, but they're going to be heavily in debt.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to all of a sudden have a bigger empire than they had anticipated.
Right.
So certainly they're not bad about it, but a bigger empire than they had anticipated. And empires cost money. They're very expensive. They make money through exploitative labor, but they're very expensive. So it's like all of a sudden you in London have to think about the American colonies and then west of the Ohio Valley. And then where does that end? I guess the Pacific, right? And then you have to kind of like, I guess, worry about the Spanish. And then like you have to think about like Bengal, and then you have to think about Senegal, and then you have to think about all these places. And I say like have to, because like we're them, right? Because they're colonizers, right? But like
perhaps simply don't colonize.
that takes an enormous amount of money and resources, right? Not to mention that British Crown had piled so much money into fighting this war.
Yeah.
The French had piled so much money into this war. So both of these kind of found that the French see their geopolitical reality hampered greatly, right? The French find themselves in debt.
Mhm.
The French find themselves in the mid-18th century with increased social stratification, this really
Mhm.
sharp divide between the rich and the poor, which then is, of course, a straight trajectory of the French Revolution, right? The British find themselves with a large empire, with an American series of colonies that had mobilized together
Mhm.
in the French Indian War were very different, right? Like people in Massachusetts and people in Georgia, very different, but had mobilized in part
Mhm.
with the crown. So they all kind of are talking to each other. They find themselves with an ungainly empire,
Mhm.
and they find themselves heavily in debt. As a result, they're going to start taxing that empire, right? More gets to something like, there's more cogs in the wheel to get us to the Stamp Act, but like,
Right.
this is to say, like, you don't get the American Revolution without the broader 7 Years' War.
Right, and
Right.
I'm trying to map it out in my head, but the 7 Years' War ends 63.
Mhm.
We're getting early rumblings of revolution. 73, 74.
Right there,
Yeah, I
right
mean,
there.
like 10 years, like on the dot.
Yeah.
And to think about then what happens to France post 7 Years' War, the rise of capital B British Empire
Mhm.
post 7 Years' War.
Absolutely.
And then the theater that plays out in starting not even 10 years later, the role that France plays in. I mean, that's really creepy that the revolution officially ends with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 83.
Right.
I mean, that's 20 years, like,
20 years.
in the dot.
Yep. And that a lot changes in that 20 years.
Oh, boy.
Right. But like, yeah, so it's like, we did like kind of two big ones in a row, right? Because it's like the Treaty of Easton, in a way, like there's don't I always say you don't want to speak in like absolutes, right? But like
Yeah.
the Treaty of Easton in a way forges the modern world, right? Like kind of the things laid out here in this little frontier village will reverberate into the end of
Yeah.
the 18th century for absolute certain.
Oh,
Right?
yeah,
And it's of course also like that, like the Treaty of Easton is one of several treaties that are
Mhm.
happening locally, kind of in broader Pennsylvania. There's a failed treaty in 1777 during the war that I won't get into, but I'm very into, right? So it's like this whole like interaction of these nations
Mhm.
forms the 18th century.
Mhm.
But that is the broader American story is of course overshadowed by the walking purchase,
Right.
right? Because like while in Easton in 1758,
Mhm.
uh, the British and these 13 nations are meeting as nations and having treaty, right? Like that story of the walking purchase will become the norm into the 19th century, into indigenous removal, into Indian wars, into the Trail of Tears, right? So it's like that we're really looking at these stories that kind of set up this relationship of what North America could be.
Right.
And it's really, when you think of it, because it's like, I don't want to make the case that like the Treaty of Easton was all sunshine and roses and wasn't colonial, because
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
it was colonial, right? But like, in a way, those two things that happen here are two separate trajectories. They're two separate possibilities, right? So the Treaty of Easton was colonial, but was this idea that like, oh, we can meet as nations, right? And have treaty, and you could have your land over there, and you can be there. And there's, of course, there's a lot there that is the idea that your land is there. We're going to say where your land is, but there is this possibility of self-governed coexistence. And then there is the other possibility of the walking purchase, which is removal, right? Both of those happen in the long scope of American history. We heavily go walking purchase, right? So I think it's like those moments happening here in the Lehigh Valley and here in Easton are these kind of like important pieces of a broader American story. Doesn't really get talked about that much.
Right. Yeah, so we have about 10 minutes left, so not foundational document aside, valuable artifact aside, as we, we could go on and on about that forever. it's in great condition.
It's an amazing
Like, all
condition.
things considered,
Yeah,
for a
right.
250-year-old piece of parchment. What are some of the little details that we can still see on it? Like, I can read the handwriting.
You can read the handwriting very well. It's exceptionally legible, which you'd expect from a legal document,
Yeah,
written by a
right.
scribal hand, right? So it looks great. I won't point the stuff out because I can't move, I don't want to move the camera and mess everything up, but people should come and see
Yes.
in Easton
You can do
here,
that, yeah.
like literally right in the front door, this document that possibly shaped the 18th century in the modern world, right? But things I think about, right,
Mhm.
is the kind of where people are signing.
Mhm.
There's like people signing like Conrad Weiser, right? But you can see like, various named leaders of these nations making their mark or making their sign, right? So it's like a document that all these people, that's like they're on the table and they're all there,
Mhm.
right? There's this really kind of amazing moment right here, I think,
Mhm.
where someone traced their pipe
Yeah,
as a
I
way
can see
to
it. Yeah.
delineate that's where they're signing, right? This is like my identity.
Uh-huh.
There's that map of New Jersey.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's talked about as one of the first maps of New Jersey as we know it, but great map of New Jersey.
Mhm.
A thing that I always think of every time I walk by it, when I look at it, especially on the back, and I think that's why I think of it, because usually I go this way, is it is parchment, right?
Mhm.
And you can see even through the glass, and it's really like through like two panes of glass, you can
Mhm.
see it. Like the pores in the surface of the material, because porcelain, I mean, not porcelain, parchment is animal skin,
Mhm.
right? So it's not paper as we think of it, which is like
Right.
in 18th century is like rag paper or anything like that. Porcelain,
Again.
again, parchment is
Coffee makers upstairs.
animal skin that has been processed, right? So it's like when you're looking at parchment, you can see the pores in the skin of it, right? And that's kind of like integral to the document itself. It's why the document's shaped the way it is in a way, because you certainly, there's this way that you trim 18th century documents like the Treaty of Easton is, that when you fold it, it kind of all lays in together. But like part of what caused that shape
Mhm.
is that when you're making parchment, you take the skin, you stretch it on a frame, and then you scrape it, right? So you're scraping off like the hair. Sometimes old parchment, you can see like hair is still there and kind of stuff like that. But you're scraping it, and then you have something that's like literally the surface of a drum. This is literally what it is. And then you cut it out. So it's like sometimes old parchment, you can see like the evidence of where you cut it off the frame. The Treaty of Easton doesn't do that. So it is this like piece of, as an animal that was alive probably in early 1780, 1758, give or take, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's a really cool thing. It's an awesome piece of history.
Yeah, and not to,
No, yeah,
but
no.
look, we made it 53 minutes without saying the word horror, but I'm gonna do it. Like, that's something that important people wrote on.
Yes, it is.
Multiple people.
Very
touched
very
that.
important people touched that.
Yes,
Yeah,
not
it's
to
very important.
nerd out about that kind
Yeah.
of thing, but like, you can't get closer to an original than that.
No, it's right there. Yeah.
Oh, so around the world in 54
We
minutes.
haven't talked about Bengal.
Who knew?
We do.
Who knew?
Yep.
Wasn't me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beats me. Any questions from anybody? I could keep going. Well, it's really, sorry, tangent, kind of not tangent. We think about like the East India Company and the tea coming from that part of the world, and then we have a revolution that centers on tea on the other side of the British Empire.
It's a large ungainly empire.
Wow.
It's what? Yep. Weird.
It's almost
Weird to
as
think.
if a historian could piece those puzzle pieces together.
Be a great project for some. Yes.
Not I do
No,
not have time.
I mean, no.
But, excuse me. How do you want to end this? I have no idea.
I think we're good. We can talk about next month.
Yes. Oh, goodness, yes. Next month is it's a bit more of a lighthearted one. I know a lot of what we've been talking about, so kind of depressing. Really depressing.
Yeah.
War crimes. the walking purchase. So, next week,
next
oh,
month.
not next week. Ooh, hey, I didn't say porcelain, did I? Oh, brain is gone. Next month, we are talking about Easton's last Iceman, who ran the, funny line in the newspaper that, the Iceman goeth and refrigeration wins. But boy, did he try.
Yeah, so we're gonna do all sorts of talking about ice harvesting, all that.
I want to talk about this harvesting.
think
We
it'll be
need to
great.
talk about something that's not doom and gloom.
I think that'll be great. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So if you want some lighthearted conversations,
Ice,
the business of ice.
business
if
of
you
ice.
will. Not to say, not to pull back, they don't make them like they used to.
No, they don't make
Boy,
that
don't
like
make
they
them
used
like
to.
they used to.
No, so I mean, a good way to support us is to become a member as always.
You may indeed become a member. You may support any of our artifacts, such as this lovely document behind him right here. You can sponsor an artifact. You can sponsor a program if you want to.
Perhaps this one, your favorite program.
Yes, yes. Hey, there may be a Tim and Sarah Christmas special this year. I'm not promising
We'll see what
anything, but
happens, yeah.
let's see where that goes. And won't give any spoilers away, but one of our favorite buildings will start to be open on a more regular basis. So we'll have
Absolutely.
whole conversations about what is happening over there.
So watch this space
Watch this space. 2026 is coming very quickly.
really quickly.
Oh, boy.
Yep.
I don't have time for how this is coming.
No.
So none of us do. So we will see y'all next month to talk about ice harvesting.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Take care.